Jesus put to them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No. For in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Jesus then tells some more parables before leaving to go off with his disciples, and our reading picks up there. Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. He answered, The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned in fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers. And they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let everyone with ears listen. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Most of you have probably seen the raised beds that we put in here at the church this spring. Beds that are now filled with tomatoes and peppers and squash and beans and, I suspect mostly to humor my southern roots, okra. People show up faithfully each week to weed and to water and now to pick the produce. And our small efforts are part of a growing army of community gardens scattered all around the area. And just like us, many of them are taking their harvest to the food pantries so that the food pantries will have fresh produce to give out to their clients. Now imagine for a moment that some devious soul went around to all of these community gardens and sowed weeds amongst the vegetables. And imagine more that somehow these weeds mimicked the good crops, looking virtually indistinguishable from the vegetables there until they reached maturity. And then you were able to tell the difference, the good from the bad. That's actually the situation that Jesus describes in the parable. I know our Bible simply says that an enemy sowed weeds, and I understand why it says that. If the Bible had said they sowed zizanium, none of us know what zizanium is, although that's what the parable actually says. And had the translator decided to use the common name, bearded darnel, I don't know that that would have helped many of us very much. But the fact of the matter is that bearded darnel is a weed that looks almost exactly like wheat. It is very difficult to tell from the wheat until the grain heads actually form. And just to make matters worse, darnel is mildly poisonous. And so you can understand the excitement when such weeds are found amongst the wheat and the desire to yank them out right away. But the landowner says, no, wait until the harvest. Now, over the years, this parable has often been interpreted to say that the church is a mixed bag. It contains all sorts of different folks, and we can't worry too much about purity. We have to leave that, finally, to God. This interpretation goes all the way back to St. Augustine himself, and I'm fine with it to a point. But after all, when Jesus explains the parable, he does not say that the field is the church. He says it is the world. Not the church, but the world. And certainly the world, like the church, is a mixed bag. It is filled with all sorts of folks. There are good ones and not so good and really horrible. There's enough hate and violence and war and terror in the world to convince most of us that evil is quite real. But is Jesus saying that this is simply how things are and that we are to accept it and wait for God to sort it all out sometime in the future? I actually think that questions of this sort become more and more important for the American church as we find ourselves increasingly at the margins of the culture. The days when mainline theologians such as Reinhold Niebuhr advised the president, when they help form public policy, are simply long gone. Our denomination still puts out statements saying that Congress should do this or that, and they should stop this or that, but no one really listens. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann has suggested that exile is a good metaphor, an appropriate metaphor to describe where we find ourselves now in the church. We have been deported from our comfortable homes in the mid-20th century into a strange land where the rules, well, we just don't quite understand them. The stores stay open and the youth sports leagues schedule their games during our sacred worship times. The schools are no longer our agents. They do not seek to shape our children for lives of Christian faith. The landscape of America has changed dramatically since the 1950s, and institutions such as the Presbyterian Church, which had its heyday in the 1950s, finds itself alien, an alien in a strange land. Now, when the Hebrews are deported from Israel into Babylon, made exiles, they too find themselves literally strangers in a strange land. Exile produces profound crisis, a crisis of faith. How could this have happened? Why has God let this happen? Why has God abandoned us? How will we survive? And it is into such anguish and fear that the prophet Jeremiah says, don't hope to come back real soon. Instead, stay where you are. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. And I'm not sure but what there are some parallels between the prophet's words and what Jesus says to us today. The Hebrews in exile had to figure out what it meant to be faithful in a world that did not support who they were, in a world where there was no longer a temple, where the Ark of the Covenant and its promise of God's abiding presence were gone. And in ways much less dramatic, we have to figure out how to be faithful in a world that is no longer really for us. But Jeremiah says that those Israelites must be faithful in that new context in which they find themselves. That their future is bound up with that world in which they are now located. And I think Jesus says something similar when he calls us to be faithful in the midst of a mixed field, in the midst of weeds. Now, exiles by nature are always in danger of disappearing, of simply being absorbed into the world where they now find themselves. And to keep that from happening, they must be different. They must cultivate distinguishing marks, peculiarities, if you will. They must live in ways that somehow set themselves apart, that allow them to maintain practices that are not supported by the culture at large. For the Hebrews in Babylon, Sabbath keeping and the invention of what we now know as synagogue became the crucial marks that allowed those exiles to maintain a distinct identity. But what about us? Now, I think that those Hebrews may have actually had some advantage over us. They knew they were in exile. There was no denying they were in a place that no longer supported the way God called them to live. We can deny. We can say, oh, we still live in a Christian nation, even if doing so means counting as Christian all sorts of people who have no distinguishable activities or bear any marks or bear any fruit that would indicate they actually are Christian. We can say, if only they would put prayer back in school, if only the denomination would get serious about evangelism, if only. But as much as we might want to deny, we no longer live in a Christian world, if by Christian we mean anything more than a little window dressing. We now live in exile. The people around us may not look very different from us, but fewer and fewer of them see any need to follow Jesus, to be His disciples. And I'm not making distinctions. I'm not going quite where Jesus does here. I'm not making distinctions about good and bad. I'm simply talking about those who wish to follow Jesus and those who don't. And in that sense, we find ourselves living in a field that is populated by all sorts of plants and flowers and weeds and what have you. Now, 50-some years ago, before we found ourselves in exile, we could look out over the American landscape and imagine that it was one vast sea of wheat. We did not need to be distinct or different or unique in any way. But if that were ever true, it certainly is not now. And in this very mixed bag of plants and flowers and weeds and so forth that we see all around us, the only way that we can hold on to our identity, the only way we can distinguish ourselves is by the grain we produce, by the fruit that we bear. And that is what Jesus calls us to do. He does not ask us to pull weeds. He asks us to bear fruit, to distinguish ourselves by the lives we live and the grain that comes from us. And that means seeking the good of all, even the weeds. We bear fruit by embodying in our lives God's coming new day for the world to see, by loving our neighbor, by longing for and working for a better world. We embody God's new kingdom. We bear fruit by losing ourselves for the sake of God's new day, by taking up the cross, by not insisting on my rights, but rather being willing to give them up, even suffer for the sake of the other, and for the hope of God's coming reign. Now, in case you've somehow missed this, there's a big fight going on in Washington right now about whether or not to raise America's debt ceiling quickly enough in time so that the federal government can borrow sufficient funds to pay off the debts that we already owe. And as so often happens when there are deadlines of this sort, they are wonderful places to play monumental games of chicken, where each side waits to see who will flinch first. And in this particular case, the question around which people may or may not flinch is whether or not we will solve America's growing debt problem by cutting enough spending, or whether we will also raise some taxes on wealthy individuals, or perhaps remove some tax loopholes or tax breaks. Now, pretty much no one wants his or her taxes raised. That's almost a given. But I am suspicious that the Jesus who says he comes to bring good news to the poor, who says to a rich man, sell all that you have and give to the poor, that he might say to me, who I don't think of myself as really rich, but I have enough to own a home and cars and TVs and computers and a motorcycle, that he would say to me, you can give up a little more tax so that the poor can have health care. And considering that Jesus said, from those to whom much is given, much will be required, I imagine he might have called those with enough wealth to live extravagantly to contribute extravagantly to the needs of the poor and the community and of the future. Now, I'm not saying spending shouldn't be cut, and I'm not talking about any particular tax structures or breaks or loopholes. I am, however, saying that Jesus calls us to bear fruit in the kingdom by distinguishing ourselves, living differently from the weeds, by living differently from the culture around us, the prevailing culture, which means not asking first, what's in it for me? But asking first, how will this impact the other? The neighbor. How will this, in some tiny way, make the world a little bit more like God's dream for the world? Now, those who are serious about following Jesus, who want to be disciples, increasingly find ourselves aliens in a strange land. Exiles surrounded by ways that are corrosive to our faith, that do not align well with what Jesus calls us to do with our lives. And we may sometimes get angry and rail against this culture. But I think it is easy, oftentimes even tempting, to simply fade into this culture, to fade into the world around us, a world that thinks Sabbath, worship, and loving your enemies, and taking up the cross to be pure foolishness. But we're supposed to know better. All praise and glory to the God who comes to us in the one who bears the cross and gives himself for others. Thanks be to God.